Right now, as you read this, the most powerful warship America has ever sent to the Middle East is running scared from a stretch of water it could cross in an afternoon. At least, that's how it looks. Because instead of taking the short route, the US Navy sent it all the way around the entire continent of Africa. 100,000 tons of nuclear-powered American steel, 90 aircraft on deck, 5,000 sailors aboard. And it deliberately avoided a stretch of water barely 20 miles wide at its narrowest. Think about that. The USS George H.W. Bush, the last Nimitz-Class supercarrier ever built, added thousands of miles and weeks of sailing to its journey, just to stay out of one narrow strait. Why would the Navy send its most valuable asset the long way around an entire continent? Why would a $13 billion warship that can flatten an enemy fleet refuse to sail through a gap it could cross in a few hours? The answer isn't fear. It's something far colder and smarter than that, and it reveals exactly how naval warfare has been quietly rewritten in an age where a $30 drone can dictate the path of a $13 billion ship. Stay with me, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Look at a map and the decision looks insane. When an East Coast carrier heads to the Middle East, there's one obvious route it has taken for decades. Out of Norfolk, Virginia, across the Atlantic, through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, down through the Suez Canal, into the Red Sea, and out through a narrow gateway called the Bab el-Mandeb into the Arabian Sea. It's the express lane. Direct from Norfolk to the Central Command Theater runs roughly 11,500 miles by that route. But the Bush didn't take it. When it left Norfolk at the end of March 2026, it turned south. Way south, past the equator, down around the bottom of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, past Cape Agulhas, then north through the Mozambique Channel and into the Indian Ocean. That detour added somewhere around 6,000 extra miles to the trip. Picture going from New York to Los Angeles, but routing through Miami first just to avoid one bridge. That's the scale of what the Navy chose to do, and it did it on purpose with its most valuable ship. And this wasn't just any ship being kept out of harm's way. The USS George H.W. Bush isn't just another carrier. It is the 10th and final Nimitz-Class supercarrier ever built, the very last one. The Nimitz-Class started joining the fleet back in the 1970s, and they became the backbone of American naval power for half a century. 10 massive nuclear-powered ships that ruled the oceans. The Bush, commissioned in 2009 at a build cost of around $6.2 billion, closed out that line. There will never be another Nimitz-Class carrier. Everything after her is the new Ford-class, and the Bush wasn't a show pony. She was blooded in real combat. From 2014 into 2015, her aircraft flew strikes against ISIS targets in Iraq and Syria, and she's operated everywhere from the Mediterranean to NATO exercises off Norway. She even pioneered design features for the future fleet. She was the first US carrier to test a more efficient single-shaft layout that later helped shape the Ford-class. The last Nimitz was, in a real sense, the bridge to whatever comes next. So when you hear that the Navy routed this ship the long way around Africa, understand what's on the table. This is the last of a legendary bloodline, a ship that incorporated design features that would later shape the Ford-class itself. The Navy doesn't gamble with a ship like that, which is exactly why the route matters, because the decision to go around tells you the Navy now treats one specific stretch of water as too dangerous even for this. So what is this water the Navy won't sail through? It's called the Bab el-Mandeb. The name means Gate of Tears in Arabic, and lately it has earned it. It's a narrow strait between Djibouti on the African side and Yemen on the Arabian side, the choke point connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. At its tightest, it's only about 18 to 20 miles across, and the main shipping channel is narrower still. For decades, it was just a busy shipping lane, tankers, container ships, and Navy vessels passing through every single day without a second thought. That's over now. Since 2023, Iran-backed Houthi forces in Yemen have turned that strait and the southern Red Sea into a shooting gallery, firing drones, anti-ship missiles, and sending small attack boats at commercial ships and warships alike. And a narrow strait is the worst possible place to get caught. There's no room to maneuver, and the time to react to an incoming missile collapses to almost nothing. The Navy looked at that math and made a call. And remember, the carrier never sails alone. The Bush travels with a strike group of escorts. On this trip, the destroyers Donald Cook, Mason, and Ross, plus a fast supply oiler to keep them fueled. That's a lot of ships to thread through a narrow hostile gap. The wider the formation, the bigger the target. Here's the detail that makes it real. Do you know the last time a US aircraft carrier actually sailed through the Bab el-Mandeb? December 2023. And the ship that did it was the USS Eisenhower, sailing into the Red Sea right as the Houthi campaign was kicking off. What followed for the Eisenhower was 9 months of the most intense naval combat the US had seen since World War II. Since then, not one American carrier has gone through that strait. Not one. Think about what that means. The United States Navy, the most powerful naval force on the planet, has effectively conceded a 20-mile stretch of water to a non-state militia armed with cheap drones and missiles. Even highly capable destroyers, the Aegis-equipped warships built specifically to shoot down incoming threats, came under repeated attack every time they tried to transit. So when it came time to move the bush, the Navy didn't roll the dice on the Gate of Tears. It sent its last Nimitz on a 6,000-mile detour instead. That's not weakness. That's a cold, professional read of risk versus reward. You don't risk a $13 billion ship and 5,000 lives to save a few days when you don't have to. There's a hard lesson behind that caution. In a narrow strait, a warship loses the two things that keep it alive in open water: distance and time. Out in the deep ocean, a carrier and its escorts can see a threat coming from far off and have minutes to react. Squeezed into a 20-mile gap with land on both sides, those minutes shrink to seconds, and there's nowhere to turn. That's why even the world's best air defense ships hate fighting in tight water. To understand why the Navy guards this ship like a national treasure, look at what it actually is. The George H.W. Bush measures 1,092 feet long. That's longer than 3 football fields end to end. Fully loaded, she displaces over 100,000 tons. 2 nuclear reactors drive her at more than 30 knots, and she can run for over 20 years without refueling. Aboard are roughly 5,000 sailors and aviators, living inside a floating steel city with its own hospital, stores, and power plant. And the real weapon is what's on the flight deck. Carrier Air Wing 7, with 4 squadrons of F/A-18 Super Hornets, electronic attack Growlers, and radar planes. During sustained operations, that air wing can launch more than 120 sorties a day, the striking power of a small air force, with no foreign bases or permissions required anywhere there's open water. Add it all up and you get a single asset worth well over $13 billion before you even count the aircraft. Now you understand the equation. That is not a ship you expose to a drones and missiles alley if you have any other option. And here's the part that should really make you think. The uncomfortable truth underneath this whole story. The threats that push this ship around an entire continent are cheap. Almost laughably cheap compared to the target. A one-way attack drone can cost a few hundred to a few $1,000s to build. Some of the improvised ones are even less. Meanwhile, the missile you'd fire to shoot that drone down can cost $1 million or more, and the ship you're protecting is worth $13 billion. That is the asymmetry that has quietly reshaped naval strategy. You don't have to sink a carrier to win. You just have to make the cost and the risk of sending it through your waters high enough that the most powerful navy on Earth decides to go around. My own take? That's the real headline here. Not that the Navy is scared, it isn't. It's that a determined enemy with a garage full of cheap drones can now influence where a superpower's most expensive warship is allowed to sail. That's a genuinely new chapter in the story of sea power, and the Bush's long voyage is the proof. But there was a reason the Navy needed this ship in position badly enough to send it halfway around the world. When the Bush finally arrived in the Central Command area on April 23, 2026, after sailing around Africa, it became the 3rd U.S. aircraft carrier operating in and around the Middle East at the same time. 3 carriers. The USS Abraham Lincoln had already been in the Arabian Sea since the start of the year. The USS Gerald R. Ford had been working the region as well, and now the Bush joined them. That's a concentration of naval power the United States hadn't put into that region since the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. 3 carriers means 3 floating air bases, hundreds of combat aircraft, and overwhelming presence spread across separate approaches: the Arabian Sea, the Gulf of Oman, the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. That kind of buildup doesn't happen by accident. It came as the United States tightened a naval blockade around the Strait of Hormuz, and pressure on Iran climbed by the week. Spreading 3 carriers across separate approaches complicates any enemy's planning. There's no single deck to target, no single route to watch. It happens when Washington wants Iran to see exactly how much firepower is parked off its coast. And to make that statement, the Navy needed the Bush there, which meant getting it there in one piece. And there's a haunting symmetry in which ship made this careful, calculated voyage. The carrier is named for George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States. But long before he was president, he was one of the youngest naval aviators in the entire Navy. He earned his wings in 1943. 3 days before his 19th birthday. He flew a torpedo bomber called the Avenger off a carrier in the Pacific during World War II, and the ship's call sign honors that to this day, Avenger. He flew 58 combat missions, and on September 2nd, 1944, over the Pacific, Japanese anti-aircraft fire hit his plane. He completed his attack run, then bailed out over the ocean and was rescued by a submarine after hours alone in the water. A 19-year-old who went to war, got shot down, survived, and came home. So there's a quiet symmetry in it. A carrier named for a young pilot who knew exactly how dangerous the sky and the sea can be, now being handled with the kind of care that keeps 5,000 young Americans alive. The Navy protecting the Bush is, in a way, honoring what Bush himself lived through. Now here's a detail that turns this from a one-off into a sign of the times. The Navy wasn't the first to start going around Africa. The commercial world got there years earlier. Back in 2024 and 2025, as the Houthi attacks intensified, the world's biggest shipping companies, container lines, tanker operators, the insurance giants behind them, quietly rerouted enormous amounts of global trade away from the Red Sea and around the Cape of Good Hope. They did the same math the Navy just did. Going around the Cape of Good Hope instead of through the Strait can add something like 4,000 to 6,000 miles and roughly 2 to 3 weeks to a voyage. A real cost in fuel, time, and wear. But every one of those companies decided that extra cost was cheaper than the risk of losing a ship, a crew, or a cargo in the Strait. So when the Bush swung south around Africa, it was, in a strange way, following a path the merchant fleet had already beaten. The most powerful navy in the world ended up making the same call as a cautious cargo company. That should tell you how fundamentally the threat has changed the map. When both the Pentagon and the global shipping industry agree a waterway isn't worth the risk, that waterway has effectively been closed by a handful of cheap weapons. And here's what makes this voyage feel like the end of something. Think about what this ship represents. She is the last Nimitz-Class carrier, the final chapter of a class that defined American sea power for 50 years. The ships that are supposed to replace the Nimitz fleet are the new Ford class, starting with the USS Gerald R. Ford. But those ships have had a long, troubled road into service. Years of delays, technical problems, and the brutal difficulty of building a 100,000-ton nuclear carrier in a shipbuilding base stretched far too thin. So for now, the old guard still carries the load. The Bush, the last of the Nimitz line, is still out there doing the hard, dangerous work, sailing around continents, parking off hostile coasts, projecting power, while the future fleet slowly, expensively comes together behind it. There's something poetic in that. The very last of a legendary class, still standing watch, still the ship the Navy reaches for when it needs presence in a dangerous part of the world. Not because she's the newest, because she's here, she's proven, and she's ready. So let's bring it home. Why did the US Navy sail its last Nimitz carrier all the way around Africa? Not out of fear, out of cold, hard professionalism. The Bab el-Mandeb has become a place where cheap drones and missiles can threaten even the most capable warships, and a narrow strait gives a multi-billion-dollar ship nowhere to hide. So the Navy made the smart call. Protect the asset, take the long way, arrive ready to fight. The detour cost time and fuel, but it kept a $13 billion ship and 5,000 Americans out of an unnecessary fight on someone else's terms. And in doing so, the Bush told us something important about this era of warfare. Sea power isn't just about who has the biggest ship anymore. It's about who can impose costs on whom. A superpower can still go anywhere it wants, but now it has to decide whether the trip is worth it. The Bush decided the smart move was to go around, and that single decision, made about the last Nimitz carrier ever built, is one of the clearest signs yet of how the rules at sea are being rewritten. The USS George H.W. Bush is in the Middle East now, flying combat missions, doing exactly the job it was built for. It got there not by charging through the Gate of Tears, but by quietly sailing around an entire continent to arrive intact and ready. The last Nimitz-Class carrier, handled with the care a ship like that deserves. Here's my question for you, and I really want to know what you think. Was sailing around Africa the smart, professional move, protecting an irreplaceable ship from a pointless risk? Or is it a warning sign? Proof that cheap weapons are starting to push even American supercarriers off the map. Tell me in the comments, I read them. If you got something out of this, subscribe. We go deep on the ships, the history, and the decisions behind American sea power. Until next time.